Hi, this is Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. Today, actually, I'm not going to talk about fountain pens. I am going to talk about a nib, this very interesting nib that is made by the Kakimori company in Japan. They specialize in writing and in making really available on their shop all kinds of tools for doing beautiful writing. That's what they say. I'm actually interested in this nib that they've developed for drawing. It's designed in such a way so that when you dip it in the ink, it lasts a lot longer than a traditional dip pen for really almost a page of writing. So that's very exciting. And the other thing is that it allows for line variation depending on how you hold it and how hard you press. So that also is very interesting. I mean, that's typical of a dip pen, but the way this writes is very smooth, much smoother than a traditional dip pen nib that I'm used to. So it has two advantages. It's not cheap. This is the brass version. There's a stainless steel version. This one is $50. There's another version that perhaps is a little finer, but I read that it was a little scratchier and I wanted it to be smooth. Maybe at another point I'll get that and I'll do a comparison. Anyway, I wanted to try this out. Now, of course, I love fountain pens and I've been using them for drawing since I was a teenager, but they have certain disadvantages over dip pens. Now, dip pens, of course, are the kind of pens that have been used since the 19th century that utilize a metal nib that you dip into a bottle of ink or an inkwell. And of course, you've seen plenty of movies and pictures of children in school in the 19th century, drawing and writing with their little inkwells on their desks and everything. And actually, they continue to use those kinds of pens into the 20th century. And it's fun to see things like presidents of the United States, like Lyndon Johnson, signing the Civil Rights Act still with a dip pen. So dip pens have been used by politicians, etc., for a long time, but they are mostly now used by artists and calligraphers. Now, one of the disadvantages of fountain pens, of course, is that they don't tolerate India ink or most pigmented inks that might have shellac in them or acrylic in them. And there are some wonderful inks, colored inks, that use acrylic, and those kinds of pigmented inks get clogged in a fountain pen, so you can't use them. And unfortunately, a lot of fountain pen inks too are fugitive. That means that they fade in the sunlight. They are not permanent, although you can get waterproof and permanent document fountain pen inks. They don't have the same characteristics as pigmented inks. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of line variation or flex and the ability to get a pen to flex. And I've spent a lot of time on that and reviewing pens, fountain pens that do flex, vintage ones and contemporary ones, but they all seem to have some kind of problem in that, usually having to do with ink flow. And it's hard under $100 to get a really good flex pen, although they do exist. Often you have to go to 14 karat gold or you have to get a vintage pen. But dip pen nibs like the Zebra Comic G nib that's on this dip pen, are very affordable. I mean, they only cost a few dollars. They run out. You have to change them a lot. But this is the kind of nib. That comic book artists might use to ink their comic book, or illustrators use. It's similar to the kind of nib that Maurice Sendak used to do Where the Wild Things Are, and lots of other illustrators like Charles Schulz and Peanuts. So artists are still using these dip pen, but they have disadvantages in that they are scratchy when you write with them, and they're very pointy. And even though they have wonderful line variation, the ability to do that, they have a tendency sometimes to pick up some of the paper when they're so sharp, and that can then pick up more ink. The other thing is that you can kind of stutter with them across the paper. They pick up some of the paper, or you jostle them on the paper and it sprays ink, or they blot because you're constantly sticking in the ink well, and you can sometimes, if you don't do it right, you get a big blob of ink on your drawing. So they can be really tricky. But of course, artists learn to use these tools, and they learn their quirks, and they become an extension of their hand. But they're not particularly easy to use if you're not familiar with them. So I was very excited to see how this nib works because, number one, it's quite smooth, and it has the marvelous advantage. You don't have to keep dipping it in the ink as much as you do with a standard dip pen nib. Now, both of these kinds of pens, though, still have the disadvantage that you have to bring with you some kind of ink bottle and ink if you're going to go out into the world. The great thing about a fountain pen and other kinds of pens, magic markers, technical pens, portable pens, is that the ink is in the pen, so you don't have to carry around a bottle and make a mess, or all those problems. And that's still the disadvantage with this kind of nib. So what am I going to do here? So I haven't been using this nib for a long time, actually, but I thought it would be fun to sort of share with you my experience with it, and sort of what is it like to use it as a newbie. And so what I've done is I've done a drawing of my backyard, and I experimented with it. And what I discovered is that it actually doesn't draw like a traditional, what I think is a traditional dip pen nib. That's great on one level. It's very smooth. I love the way it feels across the paper. In some ways, it reminds me of a bamboo pen. Now, these are very inexpensive, and I strongly recommend them. You dip this in the ink just like a regular dip pen, and it's made out of bamboo, and these are very inexpensive. But you have to keep dipping them, and they're very kind of inconsistent and expressive. I love using these bamboo nibs, but they're not nearly as smooth as the brass nib on this dip pen, the Japanese brass nib. But they, but it was what I felt was the closest. And I very much like the expressiveness of this nib, how it wrote, how it floated across the page, and that gave me some of the freedom and feeling of a fountain pen that I like so much, which I don't feel when I'm using a typical dip pen. Much smoother than the bamboo pen, I would say. So that is really great. One thing I would mention, though, is when you're using it for a while, you do have to clean it out. It gets sort of gunky, so much ink on it when you're doing an extensive drawing. Now, keep in mind, this company, Kakimori, is all about writing. And of course, this nib, I think, is really designed to write Japanese characters and the variation of Japanese characters. You get different line widths, not so much by how hard you press, which is typical of a flax nib, but more by what angle you hold the pen. When you hold it closer to 90 degrees, you get a thinner line. When you put the farther down you hold it, it gets a thicker line. It can almost be like a brush when it's on its side. It reminds me of a fude nib in some ways in that respect. So it's different than how you might press on a standard Zebra G nib, for example. Anyway, I did an elaborate drawing of the backyard, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed it up. It's not going to take an hour to go through it, but I'm going to sort of do a narrative with it to just sort of point out some of the things that are happening when I use it. I really like the way it makes an outline. I think that it does a really great job of that. I also like the fact that you can do sort of areas, dark areas, and fill in areas. But like anything else, it takes time to get used to it. I really enjoy it. I think I understand now why people are so excited about it. And it is nice not to have to keep sticking in the ink over and over again. But it's not super consistent, at least when I was using it. And maybe after a while, you can get it to be sort of the same. There's a lot of variation. That's great when you're doing a landscape. That's what makes it expressive. But that might not be so great for writing. And I am rather adamant here. I am not reviewing this nib as something you could use for writing or journaling. Undoubtedly, some people intend to use it for that. That's what it's for. But this is really a review for someone out there who's an artist and is thinking about getting this as an art pen. The thing I like the best about the pen is the beautiful, smooth line that you get, outline that you can get with it. And the way it just sort of floats across the page. In that sense, it's more like a fountain pen and it's like a dip pen. Or at least the kind of dip pens that I often use for drawing because they're quite scratchy. This is very smooth. Now, if I were using a traditional dip pen, it would need to be dipped into the ink by now. This is really amazing how far you can go. Before you have to dip it in. Now, with a traditional dip pen, the harder you press, the thicker the line. Here, the line is consistent as long as you use the same angle. But if you want a thicker line, if you come down, you get a thicker line. If you come up, you get a thinner line. It's great for doing big areas of black ink, almost like a brush if you want, or you can get a finer line, but not so great for very fine line. It's very, very expressive, I think. A lot of fun to use. It's great not to have to dip the pen so much. Just to give you a sense of comparison, here is a traditional dip pen with a G nib, which is very nice. It has flex, so when I press down I can get a variation in the line, but you can hear, I think you can, how scratchy this is. But this is better for cross-hatching. And this runs out of ink very quickly. Now, actually, I'm a great advocate of using different pens when you draw. So there's nothing wrong with using this for outlines and a G nib for cross-hatching. Just like in painting, I would never use just one brush. But I am impressed at the amount of variation you can get. As always, if you find this useful, please subscribe. It's a great way to support the channel, and it doesn't cost you anything.